I like these books so much. They're so much fun. I really do enjoy them, and I hope you are enjoying them with me too. Welcome to the D. Louise book series. I'm Christina K-R-I-S. I should go. My name, Kristina. This is the D. Louise book series where we read books and talk books. And it's nice to meet you. And I will hope that you will like and subscribe to my channel, please. I don't have special effects. I don't have theme music. I don't have anything else that everybody else has. This is what you see, what you get, Roots Web Simpleton. And today we are talking about Murder on Mulberry Bend, book 5 in the Gaslight series. Sarah Brandt and Frank Malloy. Sarah is a midwife. She comes from a very, very rich family. However, due to circumstances that were explained in the first book, she was estranged from her parents. She married a doctor, and when he died, she took over his practice and became a midwife. And they were not too happy with her about this. So slowly she's working back into their graces. Slowly they're opening communication lines again, and she's spending time with her parents on and off. Frank Malloy is a detective sergeant with the New York Police Department, and he has used her on several occasions when she can help him solve murder mysteries or talk to relatives if the victim is a little on the wealthier side, or even if it's on the poorer side and she's delivered babies for the family, he uses her. So, and then we have Mrs. Ellsworth. She's the neighbor. I love this woman. I'm going to do a podcast just on her when we finish the series. And we have her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Decker. And Mrs. Malloy is Frank's mother. She's not too approving of Sarah. And then we have Brian, Frank's son from his marriage, but his wife is deceased. She died after childbirth. So, and we're going to gain a couple of extra characters in the next couple of books. We gain one at the end of this, but there'll be a second one coming along soon after. So, no, I forgot to mention that Nelson, Mrs. Ellsworth's son, works at the bank, and Dennis is his boss, Richard Dennis, and he is also a friend of Sarah's parents, so they are acquainted. And Richard Dennis takes her on a date to the opera, and he's also the bank where Nelson works. And his wife died several years ago of a fever, and so him and Sarah are just, going out for each other's company. They're not pursuing a romantic relationship at this juncture. And Frank is also pursuing. Don't come on my computer. Doesn't know. Frank is also pursuing, per Sarah's request. He's investigating into Sarah Brandt's husband's death, and he's doing some research into that, and he's making some discoveries. So Frank talks to Danny. He gets a lead in the last book. He gets a lead, and the lead leads him to Danny. And Danny tells him a little something, but not before Frank gets hurt in the incident, just slightly hurt. And then we're with Mrs. Ellsworth, and I've got to quote her, and I'm going to do a whole podcast on these quotes. I just love it. Oh my, what a nice thing to do. I do hope you have included some shoes in your donation. Sarah is taking clothes to the mission. Her and Richard had visited the mission, and now she wants to take clothes. Giving one a pair of shoes is very good luck. I'm afraid No, wait, I'm wrong about that, Mrs. Ellsworth corrected herself, frowning in concentration. It may be new shoes that bring good luck. I'm not sure what old shoes bring. Oh, yes, I am. They're good luck for the bride and groom, aren't they? To tie behind their carriage. Yes, so they must be good luck for everyone, don't you think? She asked, satisfied she had solved the problem of the value of old shoes. I don't know, Sarah said diplomatically. She never bothered to argue with Mrs. Ellsworth's superstitions. In any event, I didn't have any shoes I could donate, so I'm only giving my clothes away. So then later, Dennis and her go to the mission, and they talk to Mrs. Wells about the history of the mission. Once again, Miss Wells studied Sarah for a moment before replying. My dear husband started the mission more than 7 years ago. It was his dream and his calling. He worked in this part of the city for a long time, preaching on street corners and ministering to the poor wherever he could find a place, before he was finally able to purchase this house. She turned her gaze to Dennis. He was only able to do so because of the generosity of a wealthy benefactor. How fortunate, Dennis managed, a somewhat nonplussed at what might have been a very broad hint that it was his generosity would be appreciated. Fortune has nothing to do with it, Mr. Dennis. The Lord provided. Of course, Dennis murmured, properly rebuked. Is your husband busy? Sarah asked to save him from more embarrassment. I'd love to meet him. And no, she lets them know that her husband is deceased. So they tour the mission, and then Sarah goes to meet Frank and Brian at the doctor's appointment, and Brian is able. The surgery was successful. He's able to walk. He has a little bit of a limp, but he's able to walk. Everybody celebrates. It's excellent. The kid's gonna take a while to get used to it. He's 3 at this point, I believe, and he's taking baby steps, and he's putting pressure on the foot, and he's like, oh, I can stand up. And then we have a little unsettling moment. Frank goes to a murder in the park, and the woman is wearing Sarah's clothes, and he's absolutely petrified and horrified and heartbroken that the victim is Sarah. And then they turn her over, and he discovers it is not Sarah, that she was just wearing Sarah's clothes. And you and I know that Sarah just took clothes to the mission, so obviously it's one of the girls from the mission who was killed. So Frank goes running to her house and gives her a huge hug and tells her about the body in the park, and that he thought it was her, and that the girl was wearing her clothing. And she tells him the girl's name was Amelia, and Frank believes the girl was killed with a stiletto. So then Frank and Sarah talk about if it could possibly be the Black Hand. That's a big Italian organization in New York at this juncture. So then she goes to see her parents. Her parents want to know about her date with Richard to the opera. And she tells them about that, and how her and Dennis went to the mission, and how she would like her parents to hold a party with Dennis as the host to raise money for the mission, to supply them with food and clothing and other stuff. So they agree to do this, and Frank agrees to be the host. And so Sarah goes to talk to Mrs. Wells at the mission and learn a little bit of Amelia's story. That's the dead girl. And let's see. I'm on the wrong page. Her family was no worse than most, I suppose. The Italians are of an emotional temperament, as I'm sure you know. Emilia was a sensitive girl. She suffered more than most under her parents' inability to control themselves. I'm afraid that made her easy prey for the wrong kind of man. And Sarah goes, well, how did she come to the mission? And Mrs. Wells says, God, she's got to go off every single video all day long. Mrs. Wells sighed. The first time she was desperate when her lover refused to marry her. She had enough self-respect to leave him, but her parents refused to take her back. She had disgraced them, they said, as if people like that had any honor to begin with. Her contempt was probably well deserved, Sarah thought. People who turned a child away were despicable. So she came to the mission, Sarah guessed. Not then, Mrs. Wells said with a sigh. She allowed herself to be deceived by yet another man who was even worse than first. This one forced her to sell herself on the streets. How did she manage to get away from him? She became ill and he threw her out. She wandered the streets and ended up on our doorstep. So that's how Emmeline, ended up at the mission. So Frank talks to Emily's parents. Her mother doesn't like her daughter. Her father likes his daughter, and he doesn't know. The father doesn't know some stuff, and the mother doesn't know some stuff, and there's confusion about Amelia. So she also tells Mrs. Wells about the party and asks her to come to her parents' house, and they'll send a carriage for her and everything. So Mrs. Donato later confesses to Sarah that on the way over to America, she was raped by some sailors. So that's why she doesn't like Amelia, because she totally believes that the child is one of the sailors' children. And she really wanted the child to die. And so she's got all this guilt about this situation. What she doesn't know is that her child did die at birth, but that the midwife had a baby from another person, and the other person wanted to give up their child. So the father did a switcheroo. So he's known the whole life that Amelia was not his child, and he thought he was pleasing his wife by providing her with a child to love when she had the guilt over the fact that she was raped. And the sun is just killing me here. So there's neither one of them know as of yet. So they tell Frank and Sarah that Amelia had two guys. She had Ugo and Luca. And neither guy pans out to be any worry about to being the killer. So then Mrs. Ellsworth has another little piece of knowledge, and this is probably a superstition that we all know about. Sarah looked where she was pointing, expecting to see that a poisonous snake had somehow traveled into her foyer. Instead, all she saw was her own umbrella dripping quietly onto the floor. You can't open an umbrella in a house, Mrs. Ellsworth informed her. Appalled, she hastily dropped her own onto the floor and snatched up Sarah's to close it. What were you thinking? She'd been thinking it would dry more quickly if it were open, but of course she didn't say that to Mrs. Ellsworth. I suppose that's bad luck, she guessed. Mrs. Ellsworth's superstitions were legion. It certainly is, clutching the offending object to her as if she could shelter it from the evil spirits that might be ready to descend. I had no idea, Sarah admitted apologetically. I'll be more careful in the future. Then she reached down to pick up the umbrella that Mrs. Ellsworth had dropped in her haste to rescue Sarah. Don't touch that! Mrs. Ellsworth cried, startling all over again. She jumped and hastily holding both hands up to prove she had obeyed the command. It can't be bad luck just to pick up an umbrella, she asked in amazement. It's bad luck to let someone else pick an umbrella you dropped, she explained as if to a child, bending to pick it up herself. Of course, now that I remember, the bad luck is that you'll become a spinster for the rest of your life. Since I'm not in any danger of becoming a spinster, I suppose it's all right that she picked it up. I love Mrs. Ellsworth. So she talks to Mr. Ellsworth about the investigation. Then she goes to the mission. She wants to volunteer to teach general hygiene to the girls. Because Mrs. Wells is like, what? You want to come here and be a midwife? We don't need a midwife. We're fingers crossed. We don't need a midwife. And Sarah goes, no, I want to teach them hygiene, how to keep themselves clean, because being clean will keep you free, well, help keep you free of diseases. They should have taught that years ago to surgeons during the Civil War. And then Frank, of course, investigates Ugo and Luca, and neither man had motive to kill Emily. Then Frank is continuing on this other mission. He told Sarah that he would look into the murder of her husband, and it's a cold case. It's from 3 years ago. And so he's looking into it, and he got a lead in the last book, and he's pursuing that lead in this book. And he finds Danny, and he talks with Danny, and Danny gives him some information. We also, we have, I guess it's not too giving it away, but we have a new character. Finally, the bells summoned the girls to their room meal, and they reluctantly took their leave of her after extracting numerous promises that she would return. Only then did she notice the red-haired girl, Maeve, still lingering. She hadn't joined the group that had surrounded Sarah, but had hung back. When they were alone, she came forward. "Did you have a question, Maeve?" Sarah asked, kindly hoping to break through the animosity. Only then did she correctly identify the expression in Maeve's eyes. She was defiant and haughty. Sarah could think of no other word to describe her. She came right up, looked Sarah straight in the eye, then turned and walked out of the room. Clearly, she had wanted Sarah to know she didn't need her attention the way the other girls did. She didn't even want it. Yeah, we're going to get around to that. There's also a girl in the mission who is, I wouldn't call her mute. She can hear fine. She just refuses to speak. We will discover books later that she had an incident in her early life. She's not quite 5 or 6 yet, so she's really little. And it froze her, horrified her so much that she refuses to talk. She will nod her head and shake her head, but she will not talk. So Maeve and Aggie right now. That will change later on, but it's Maeve and Aggie. So then Frank questions, he had gotten to go see Danny about Tom Brand, and he got cut, and he put the guy in jail. And then he talks to the guy in jail about giving up his friend Danny, and then he goes to question Danny, and Danny tells him some really interesting news. And then Mrs. Donato, Frank had told Sarah to stay away from the Donatos, but Sarah can't help it. She takes a basket of food. Mrs. Donato's being proud and says they don't need her food, they don't need her charity, and then she confesses about the sailor thing. They have the fundraising party at her parents' house, and they raise some money, and Mrs. Wells brings Sarah and Gina to the party with her, two of the girls. And she gets to speak with Maeve a little bit more. And Sarah also talks to friends of Richard Dennis about Hazel. Hazel was his wife and how she died. And that will later come into question towards the end of the book. That's one of those things that you didn't see coming. It's another little twisty twist. So Mrs. Ellsworth is here again. "Good evening, Mrs. Ellsworth. I hope you're keeping well," he said as pleasantly as he could, considering how furious he was with Sarah Brand. "I am fine, thank you, Mr. Malloy. I knew you'd be calling tonight. Either you or Mr. Dennis. I dropped a knife at dinner. Knife falls, gentleman calls, or at least that's what they say." You gotta love Mrs. Ellsworth. So Sarah talks to him about Mrs. Wells and the mission, and Frank talks to Danny and gets some more information. And she also talks to her mother about Amelia. And we have one final little tidbit on Mrs. Ellsworth. Sarah picked up a comb to part her hair so she could start wrapping it tightly around her head to go under the wig. She was going to a party at her parents' house, and she was going to wear a costume. Um, Good heavens, the old woman said, picking up the comb and placing it out of Sarah's reach. You can't comb your hair at night. It's bad luck. Wasn't anything safe to do around Mrs. Ellsworth? How am I supposed to put this wig on? Sarah said in exasperation. You use a brush, of course, Mrs. Ellsworth said. That's why women only brush their hair at night. Go figure. So Sarah gets a lead on the murderer. She believes it's Mrs. Donato because of the murder weapon. Mrs. Donato confesses to murder that she did not commit out of guilt of her feelings over her daughter and not knowing what her husband did, because then her husband fesses up what he did, and they take her to the tombs. Frank arrests her because she confessed, and then she tries to hang herself, and the priest comes in and is taking her confessional and her stuff the next day. And while he's visiting Mrs. Donato in jail, he sees Mrs. Brandt, and he tells Mrs. Brandt that Mrs. Donato did not in any way, shape, or form kill her daughter. So Sarah believes him, and she goes on an additional investigation. And then to find out who really killed Emilia and who may have killed Richard Dennis's wife, and what's going to happen to the mission, you will have to read the book. I love the notes at the end of the book by Victoria Thompson. These are I enjoy these immensely. And I'll just do a little bit of there. As the granddaughter of Italian immigrants, I've long been aware of the prejudice the Italians endured when they began coming to America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I was fascinated to learn, however, that the Irish, who had been a recent group of immigrants to endure prosecution, were among those prosecuting the Italians. He's like, well, we got here first, so they're going to prosecute us, we're going to prosecute you. Shit rolls downhill. But anyways, so if you want to know who did all the murdering, there's a couple of twisties at the end. There's a really big twist is Frank discovers who killed Sarah's husband, Tom Brandt, and who killed Emilia, and who killed Hazel, Richard Dennis's wife, and what's Richard Dennis's fate, because it's not a good one at the end of the book. So please hit the like and subscribe and let me know I'm doing a good job. I'm trying really hard here. These are really good books, and I'm looking forward to book 6, Murder on Marble Row. We'll be doing this in the next couple days. I've got a surprise. I'm going to start a new series. So please hit the like and subscribe. Thank you.